Great. Hi, thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here. And my name is Joe Michalski, and I'm in King's in the Department of Sociology. So complex adaptive systems exist throughout nature with all of organizational complexity, which of course includes Homo sapiens and their roots. In sociology, we've carved out a slice of complexity to focus on the structural and cultural determinants of human behavior, but usually without considering the biopsychological or ecological parameters within which behaviors unfold. And we struggle with understanding nonlinear, dynamic, co-evolving emergent systems of behavior. So we just mostly don't frame the issues that way. Sociological abstracts, our common database, contains 2 million entries drawn from 1,800 journals. And as of today, only 125 articles have the phrase complex adaptive systems in the abstract. So I'm definitely outside of the mainstream of talking about this here, right? So standard science breaks down nature to study and explain behaviors, linked to 4 levels of emergent, evolved complexity: matter, life, mind, and culture. We're trained to study phenomena in our own fields, right? And while scientific knowledge is advanced, at some point we're sort of plagued by the Humpty Dumpty problem. How do we unify the information to explain the emergent properties of phenomena at different levels of behavioral complexity? And some turn to the study of complex adaptive systems. And in my case, I'm interested in a general unified theory of social sciences, or GUTSS. It's an integrative theoretical approach that strives to explain social behavior as rooted in energy and information exchanges, conditioned by people's relative locations and historical situatedness within dynamic social fields of interaction. So the GUTSS situates embodied human beings within their natural environments to examine the forces that influence social interactions. And that requires an explicit effort to combine our knowledge of language, culture, and social fields, as well as the underlying neuropsychological mechanisms that condition behavioral responses in our environments, which is complexity. So in my view, human behaviors are the adaptive responses to multiple forces rooted in different forms of energy to exchange information across 5 levels of experiential reality. The behavioral investment framework focuses on the biopsychological drivers and energy investments of Homo sapiens as living sentient organisms. Socialization framework involves the full range, the psychological components of the processes associated with human learning, personality development, and identity formation. The cultural justification framework looks at the symbolic information in the forms of human reasoning that people use to evaluate their environments and justify their actions based on their linguistic and cultural backgrounds. The social location framework includes the social networks within which human beings are located and the relative statuses of those involved in their interpersonal exchanges within social fields. And then, of course, the societal context framework refers to the broader socio-historical and institutional context within which individuals and groups are situated. So today's talk, I'm only focusing on what I call linguistic tribalism as a homophilic force that shapes complex human interactions through entity efficiencies. So human social life requires energy to organize information, and thus can't escape the second law of thermodynamics. Closed systems entropy increases over time, tending toward a state of equilibrium absent new energy inputs. And yet sociologists historically, or ironically perhaps, haven't studied entropy's impact on social life, much beyond the ideas of statistical entropy or Shannon entropy. We don't spend much time examining the underlying energy flows and mechanisms that produce social interactions. We often ignore psychological processes and key features of the biosphere and physical environments that constrain our responses. To be fair, the cognitive division of labor has meant disciplines stake out their territorial claims, linked to different levels of analysis and informational complexity, and we prefer our own disciplines. At King's, for example, the faculty recently offered input into our next academic plan. In the summary report, they state, none of the reporting departments advocated for school formation. Several departments said they did not see intellectual merits in these kinds of groupings for their fields and cannot envision an academically coherent purpose. Talk about interdisciplinarity? I'm not sure I've seen that there. We're more comfortable in our own tribes. And of course, I'm going to explain that in part, right? But first, a bit more intellectual scaffolding. So all behavioral processes require workable energy, subject to the relevant forces at different levels of complexity. The failure to capture free energy and perform the work required to maintain physical, biological, psychological, and social systems leads to their entropic demise. So my approach focuses then on social energy to identify the forces that affect energy transfers within our fields of interaction. And these fields define social structure, or the distribution of people among different positions and their social associations. Every encounter of actors involves a social geometry that varies across time and space, which literally shapes how social exchanges unfold. And analogous to the physical universe, the social universe has 3 dimensions plus social time or history. The 3 spatial dimensions include the social scientific equivalents of height, width, and depth. So in terms of the key vectors, height refers to vertical distances, or the differences in access and control of resources, such as inequalities in wealth, power, and prestige. I briefly noted their connections with cognitive disciplines here. The width dimension captures the breadth of social life. Cultural distance refers to similarities or differences in symbolic connectedness. People share language, ethnicity, or religion, for example. These are measures of cultural similarities. The subdimensions are much broader, but combined to describe cultural diversity or heterogeneity. Anthropologists are involved in this. Think of the last presentation. Relational distance refers to the degree to which people participate in one another's lives and the depth of their involvement, time spent together in what context. Those who've been in a relationship longer, interact more often, and voluntarily have a closer or more intimate relationship. And lastly, social fields have population sizes, which expand and contract as members are born, migrate, or die. The size and density of populations, ecological niches, reflects an additional social force that creates environmental pressures. Demographers look at these issues. So human social interactions then can be assessed via their positions along each dimension in the networks of varying sizes. Our relative locations shift along each vector during our encounters with each other. Time never stands still. Certainly social time never stands still. In fact, we're already more intimate with each other now than we were 10 minutes ago, as our shared social location and time together have reduced our relational distance. I don't mean that in a weird way. It's a fact. An iron law of human interaction reflects the energy distribution principle. All else equal, social interactions vary directly as a function of physical separation. The law of distance interaction states that those with shorter distances and reduced energy costs occur more often than those involved in larger distances. And this applies equally to separations and distances in social space. So how does social space explain anything? Like, why are we attracted to some people or ideas, or conversely repelled by everything from certain groups to languages to science or religion? We have to look at the key social forces. In my opinion, the basic mechanisms that apply to exchanges of social energy and information among humans. And so today I'm just looking at one force operating along the cultural distance vector to focus on homophily as a powerful force of social gravitation and repulsion. And to simplify, I'll discuss the homophilic principle of linguistic tribalism as a major social gravitational force in establishing system boundaries. So first, there's an interpretive component to interaction, since we're embedded information processing entities. And awash in information, psychologists have confirmed we're highly selective in our attention. So the first phase of human processing occurs in nanoseconds. The brain registers visual cues, and social categorization starts with the activation of the amygdala. Humans instantly start processing social information to identify visually similar or distinct categories. We develop implicit biases to manage our cognitive loads. And of course, that interpretive process requires the acquisition of language. Categorization of visible differences sets the stage for behavioral outcomes based on our relative positions in our social fields. And so the distinguishing feature of human social behavior, at least from non-humans, is the capacity for normative evaluations via sociolinguistic interpretations and justification systems. We are the justifying animal. And these are ubiquitous and directly shaped by, one of the fundamental social forces known as homophily. So homophily refers to the notion that actors who share similar social characteristics tend to be mutually attracted at higher rates than dissimilar actors. Research confirms homogeneous groups are more common, especially assortative mating patterns, ethno-racial friendship groups, gangs and prison cliques, and in most work settings. And Smith et al. Argue homophily is a behavioral expression of the larger differentiating forces in society. such as demographic availability, institutional segregation, and affective acceptance among categories of people. So, for example, a recent study of high school student networks from European countries displayed homophilic preferences rooted in ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and cultural markers. Groups homogenize with increasing size because creating larger groups with more diversity requires more social energy. Lewis argues preferences or homophily are another way of expressing the social energy principle. As socializing within, for example, one's racial group requires less social energy and is so often preferable. Her research supports the social energy hypothesis by showing much more racial segregation among university students than Chan could predict. Similarly, the European study also found that foreign-born students modeled mostly around their country of origin and religion. And a key binding element in all of this, of course, involves language. So efficient communication requires a common language or system of information exchange. Language provides information through both culturally relevant codes and by conveying individual intentions, a window into the inner sanctum of one's private thoughts. A shared language reduces energy expenditures to interpret signals and process information quickly. And the energy varies as a function of similarities between languages spoken. Mayhew et al. Argue that it's less common than for people to engage in, quote, face-to-face interaction with others unlike themselves because more energy expenditure is required to sustain communication and coordinate action. Lacking a shared language, translators might be required, which of course involves additional energy. And even with actors committed to mutual understanding, more energy is required. People tire more quickly as frustration mounts. So the vast energy required to learn another language, for example, especially once the optimal threshold for language acquisition has passed, helps explain our reluctance to commit to learning new languages. And this extends more broadly. The principles apply to all forms of cultural exposure, such as generational preferences for musical styles. People say things like, today's music is garbage, or old people just don't get it, no cap. That's because we're exposed to distinct musical languages encoded in our lived experiences, linked to our memories, etc. Right? Social psychologists describe this as the mere exposure effect. We prefer the more familiar, the more often we're exposed to something. Hearing unknown styles of music requires much more energy to process new information. And the energy available for us to acquire new info is always finite. So we switch channels to find our music. But it's not just unfamiliarity and energy. We also have to consider the source. What's our relationship with the source of the new music? Indian, for that matter. So, for example, I bet few of you listen to Iranian music. Anybody big on Iranian music here? Maybe. Well, my wife is Iranian, okay? And her mother lives with us, and she speaks no English. And so we have Iranian music playing quite often. And I learned a lot from Farsi, by the way. Only the good words, though. And one of my sons is a professional musician, CX Violet. Anybody heard of him? Check it out. Please join him. Get his channel after promote him. But he creates more experimental music, vastly different from what I grew up with. But I listen to all the Iranian music, and I listen to all the CX Violet's music. Why? Cultural and language gaps are bridged by two main factors: my greater exposure and affinity to various styles, because guess what? I'm also a musician, so that reduces cultural distance. But also the overlap with reduced relational distance, my intimacy with those who have different musical tastes. So I'm more open to their alternatives, okay? And so language then serves as a powerful marker of cultural distance. If we speak different languages without a Rosetta Stone or Google Translate handy, we live in separate linguistic worlds. If we share a common language, we close the gap by a quantum level. Lost in Beijing, can't speak Mandarin, and need help. I might try to enlist Mandarin speakers to assist me, but my natural selection bias will be to find somebody who speaks English. I'm looking for an environmental match to ensure greater resonance between my sound waves and the potential receiver. So to the extent that we share linguistic codes, we reduce a key vector of cultural distance. Otherwise, there's a language barrier requiring time and energy to overcome. And even if we share a language, there are still gradations of cultural distance. I'm from the States originally, but I learned how to speak Canadian. So there are regional dialects, idioms, professional jargon, general vocabulary, secondary features such as accents. It's about time I learned how to speak properly here, right? I say process, not process these days, unless I go back to Virginia. And so a greater overlap in our language and our communicative repertoires leads to reduced distance in cultural space. So we require less energy to interact. So the information embedded in language directly links to the statuses that people occupy relative to everyone else. Those who occupy certain positions often share language, knowledge, subcultural codes, especially if interactions are rooted in common professions, religions, communities, and so on. All else constant, the energy expenditures required are less among those who occupy similar status positions in social space than what's necessary to interact with people who have different statuses. The more differences and distances across multiple statuses, the more barriers to overcome, the more energy required. As energy costs increase, the probabilities of conflict and social division increase as well. The energy required for mutual understanding dissipates, especially without an equal effort on both sides and shared investments of energy. Marriages or partnerships often stem from such unequal inputs. Quote, for example, he's just not trying. And unlike marriage, the relational distance or lack of intimacy between members of different, more distant groups then works against shared investments. All else equal, we tend to invest more in those with whom we have more in common, as per the homophily principle. Okay. I'll be quick, I'll wrap up here. The principle applies equally to our intellectual tribes, as I call them. Most people attend conferences, mostly just in their own fields, just like most religious folks attend their own services. Even within discipline, there's a tendency to hire certain types of scholars, or what I call intellectual homophily. If you hope to secure a job in most academic departments, you better be a certain kind of scholar. For example, here are the first words of one of the websites in my discipline. The Department of Sociology at Brock University is committed to a critical social justice approach. And that's the dominant framework within Canadian sociology. In fact, my own research has shown that less than 1 in 5 Canadian sociologists identifies a scientific approach as their main epistemological framework. People don't like science. And thus most programs wouldn't hire somebody like me who's committed to a scientific approach. And I use the Greek language, chi-square, sigma, delta, mass, and probabilities. And these are not common languages amongst those disinterested in or hostile to science. In fact, I find myself often alone, wandering in the sociological wilderness. So thanks for putting up with me. Also, homophily may lead to targeted preferences and discriminatory practices that increase social distances further between groups. Out-group members who face bias and discrimination must then expend more of their energy coping with the effects of differential treatment and then supporting each other. And they'll have less social energy than themselves to bridge gaps, which mutually reinforces patterns of segregation. Both in-group and out-group preferences reflect larger social energy forces governing social dynamics. Coordinated actions require more energy to create organization and achieve a negentropic state. And there's another implication, a tendency toward workplace tribalism, organizational homogeneity. We tend to form and join organizations comprised of others similar to ourselves. Even at King's, striving to create a diverse and inclusive environment, we operate within certain parameters. We want a certain kind of heterogeneity or diversity within our institutional homogeneity. And we produce students within our own narrow intellectual gene pools as well. In energy terms, there's an adage that relationships take work. Lewis defines social energy as the mental energy needed for social interactions. Absent investments of energy or the capture of free energy to perform work, relationships of any kind decompose or fall apart. Human relationships that work require work. Recall too, human relationships are always in motion, yet responses to changes in our locations always depend on observers' evaluations of the changes, including their relative statuses. We evaluate the extent to which two individuals, for example, are moving closer together or perhaps drifting apart. Most fluctuations are inconsequential and conflict-free. But conflicts do arise due to changes in social geometries, spending more time with one's children or at work rather than with one's partner, changing one's faith or losing my religion relative to my partner, or enjoying professional success while the partner languishes in their jobs. These are, by the way, just quick examples of relational, cultural, and vertical distances. And also conflict stems them from multiple competing social force vectors that produce status inconsistencies or clashes in social obligations. And underlying these general processes, there are two additional mechanisms that generate conflict: Conflict arises where information has been withheld, distorted, or destroyed. And conflicts arise if energy has been withheld, used inefficiently, or wasted, at least from one or more perspectives of the actors involved. I'm wrapping up here. Then energy expenditures then are needed to help participants understand their situations, create order, signal for noise, engage in social exchanges. Okay? Complex situations or relational issues deplete our energies, but especially if these social locations and distances are more pronounced. Within multi-ethnic societies, for example, groups having differing degrees of social distances linked to their socio-historical and cultural background can lead to conflict. The mere presence of another language, for example, can increase conflicts. As Smagulova notes, quote, languages in contact easily become languages in conflict. And in quote, in multicultural environments, lower levels of bilingualism correlate with higher rates of ethnic grievances and even violence. Cultural dimensions form a continuum ranging from total homogeneity to cultural diversity, with many sources then of potential conflict. These multiple distances operate concurrently in every encounter. Each force vector exerts different effects in possibly divergent directions, or it can amplify distances if they're combined. Call that intersectionality. Identical behaviors are evaluated differently based on relative statuses and relationships amongst the participants involved. A group of Black teens in hoodies walking in Toronto's financial district on a Friday afternoon elicits a different police response compared to a group of white middle-aged men in suits. Countless studies confirm more police stop and search and surveillance of certain racialized groups, who also then endure harsher legal penalties as well. So in conclusion, what are the main lessons? First, each person occupies several statuses in relation to everyone else, some overlapping, some vary. The intersection of cumulative statuses, for example, ethnicity, ancestry, gender, wealth, respectability, relative to others, shapes our interactions. Second, the approach recasts the social universe as a dynamic, complex, adaptive system of exchanges. While social networks and interaction patterns are generally stable, each person's location relative to everyone else changes with energy transfers, informational and resource exchanges, and as a byproduct of human evaluations of our inconstant statuses. Third, unremitting change in the social universe directly affects the shifting nature of our relationships. Humans have various resources and statuses that are converted to energy as actors embedded in our social fields, whereby these unfold dynamically in real time. And while I've only talked about the homophily principle of the cultural vector, the cultural distance vector, to explain human social behavior more fully requires that we study what I call the 4 fundamental social forces. This is just in physics. These include the cultural force vector, the relational force vector, the vertical force vector, and the population vector, including size and density across ecological niches. And these principles, in my view, reflect some of the core organizing features of social life, as vital to explaining human social life as mitochondria are to explaining cellular life, or quarks are to explaining subatomic life. I think we're on the edge of glory of a much deeper understanding of human social behavior in our endless search for discovery. I think for social scientists, it's an awesome time to be alive. We just have to appreciate the complexity of the explanatory challenge and why most people, quite frankly, just don't have the energy to pursue such an interdisciplinary challenge, because that takes, well, guts. So, thank you.